Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for signing up to attend today's event, an introduction to meaningful community engagement for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. We'd like to start by thanking the State Strategic Growth Council and the Department of Housing and Community Development for sponsoring today's event. And we hope you're able to walk away with a more comprehensive understanding of the program and how to craft a competitive application, considering how to incorporate community engagement. My name is Andrea Ty Ward, and along with my colleague, Kalila Haynes, I'll be one of your presenters today. I'll introduce more about myself and my organization in a moment, but want to start by going over some housekeeping items and providing an overview of what we'll cover today. First, all attendees have been muted. We had a high number of registrations and just want to ensure that things run smoothly. If you have any questions as we go along, you can enter them into the chat box. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat icon. A technical assistance team member will be working to respond to the questions that come up, and we've dedicated 15 minutes at the end of this presentation to answer questions in the Q&A. We'll do our best to answer all of your questions, but for any that we can't get to, know that we will be compiling all the questions following the call to send out in a Q&A document. Also, keep in mind that your questions can be viewed by everyone. If you have a question you feel is more sensitive in nature, you can email it to a member of the team. Our emails will be posted at the end of this presentation. So today we'll start off by introducing Estolano advisors and our technical assistance consultant team. We'll then kick off the presentation by providing a general overview of the AHSC program. Then we'll dive into defining disadvantaged communities and how to maximize community benefits. And we'll present case studies representing examples of meaningful community engagement across the state, followed by a Q&A session. We're going to do a quick poll just to get a sense of where you all are from and which case studies we should highlight from around the state. So give me a second to launch this, and we'll give folks a couple of minutes to respond to which geographic region you're most interested in learning about a successful project. And while it's going on, I can kind of get an introduction of who we are. So Estolano Advisors is an urban planning and public policy consulting firm working to build healthy, thriving, and inclusive communities. We've been a part of the Strategic Growth Council's technical assistance team that provides free TA assistance to applicants statewide. Each year, SGC contracts with technical assistance providers to offer focused TA to qualified applicants. These are the organizations contracting with SGC currently. In the most recent round of funding, 19 technical assistance assisted projects wound up submitting out of 25 total submitted applications. Of those 19, 14 were successful in obtaining funding. This is an overview of the types of services the TA team provides to potential applicants who apply for free technical assistance on behalf of the state, including general capacity building and partnership development, identifying and defining program components, and when it comes time to pull together the application, developing those materials, reviewing the narrative, and reviewing supporting documentation. And I'll just keep the poll running for folks to fill out at their leisure. So now let's jump to the second part of the agenda, where I'll speak generally about the AHSC program. At its core, this program is a greenhouse gas reduction program, even before housing and transportation. This program funds projects designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions primarily through a reduction of vehicle miles traveled. In addition to reducing GHGs, AHSC has other priority goals, what are referred to as co-benefits. AHSC seeks to direct funding into disadvantaged and low-income communities in California, which I'll explain in a bit how the program defines those communities. And the program is also about connections. How can we connect housing to jobs and other key destinations through sustainable transportation options, transit, walking, and biking, as well as maximize a myriad of community outcomes around the economy, environment, and public health. These are all part of what makes this program so unique. We like to say that the program incentives look beyond the parcel to see how the impact of extending benefits beyond a housing site results in all of the important community enhancements we just discussed. This program is also unique in the way it emphasizes cross-sector partnerships in order to create a truly holistic project. We stress this a lot. The most successful projects are built on the foundation of the strengths of these partnerships. Every partner has something that can be a value add, and recognizing and building off this are truly critical. Local government and agency planning efforts are also integral to the process. Coordinating and engaging with current planning efforts can lead to important partnerships, such as the project being included as part of a community visioning process or collaboration on an engagement event for a specific project component. Also keep in mind that not every partner necessarily needs to be a formal applicant. Eligible applicants include developers, public agencies, and transit agencies, but there is flexibility regarding how these partnerships interact and how formal they want the relationship to be. AHSC categorizes projects into 3 eligible project area types: transit-oriented development, or TOD, integrated connectivity project, or ICP, and rural innovation project area, or RIPA. Projects compete with other projects in their respective categories, and these project types are differentiated by specific transit requirements. For TOD projects, it has to be served by high quality transit, which means it must have peak period headway frequency of every 15 minutes or less and service 7 days a week. It also must have permanent infrastructure like railway or bus only lanes. For ICP projects, these cannot be served by high quality transit, but must be within half mile of a transit station or stop, with transit that departs 2 times during peak hours. For rural innovation projects, the same transit requirements apply as an ICP project, but in rural areas. So for these projects, there are also flexible transit service that are common options. The program also sets aside a certain percentage of the total funds available for each project area type. In round 5, the first line shows the proportion of funding allocated to each project. As you can imagine, the ICP category tends to have a higher number of qualifying projects competing, with 45% set aside. Each project area type also has net density requirements, which is what the second line shows. These were the round 5 net density requirements for residential projects. The last row shows the average net density achieved by projects in round 5. So you can see that the density is actually pretty high compared to the minimum requirements. So let's turn our attention to award amounts and how the awards are divided among the different components of the project scope. The maximum request for a project in round 5 was 30 million, and the average request was 22 million. And this is how a total project request is typically divided between the project scope. There are 2 requirements for how you spend your request. One is that at least 50% of your total request to be spent on housing, and you are also limited to a 10 million cap on your transportation costs. Typically, a bit more than 50% of the total request is allocated for housing, and the remainder goes to transportation and programmatic components of the application. So what does this program actually fund? Funds for housing are broken out into 2 categories: funds for the affordable housing development and for housing-related infrastructure. The latter is any infrastructure costs being required by a locality as a condition of approval for the development itself. Typically, the developer is the entity managing scoping decisions around these items. Next, we have what we refer to as sustainable transportation infrastructure. These are actual capital improvements such as sidewalks, bike lanes, and transit capital items that facilitate mode shift, so they allow people to utilize them for transportation needs instead of a car. These costs, usually because they tend to fall in the public right-of-way, are again typically managed by a public agency. Next are the transit-related amenities. These enhance the use of the sustainable transportation infrastructure, such as street trees, bus shelters, bicycle parking, etc. Again, these are usually managed by the public agency partner. Finally, PGM funds program costs. AHSC will fund operating expenses for up to 3 years for programs that fall under one of these 3 categories, up to $500,000. In addition, AHSC requires that at least 1 transit pass per unit be provided to residents. These passes can be no more than 50% of the cost of a typical transit pass. You can use the program to cover this cost. PGM doesn't just cover active transportation costs either. It can cover other eligible program costs. As you may notice, the program funds capital projects through either loans or grants. Affordable housing development funds will be provided as a loan, and all other funds will be provided as grants and paid out as reimbursements. So in the context of the AHSC program, meaningful community engagement is an intentional process that works in tandem with the development of the project scope, affordable housing units, and transportation infrastructure. As a result of this iterative engagement process, the project will provide multiple benefits that are tailored to the unique needs of a particular community and employs planning and engagement efforts that lead to transformative impact and use effective best practices. So now we'll turn to defining disadvantaged communities and how the program uses that terminology. So Assembly Bill 1550 defined that overall certain populations are especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and at least 35% of California climate investments, which AHSC falls under, must benefit these populations, which include disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, and low-income households, which are collectively known as priority population. We mentioned that AHSC seeks to invest in funding into disadvantaged communities. In fact, there is a specific programmatic requirement that at least 50% of AHSC funding go towards projects identified as being in a DAC. These communities are identified at the census tract level through a statewide tool called CalEnviroscreen. For those who aren't familiar, CalEnviroscreen produced a percentile score based on a combination of many different socioeconomic environmental factors, including poverty, housing need, asthma rates, particulate pollution, and other factors. If your project falls within a census tract that scores in the top 25% of the index, so that means anything at 75% or above, you are considered being in a disadvantaged community. However, we do want to stress that while DAC communities are important to this particular program, being outside of a DAC is not a reason to think you're not competitive or ineligible to apply for these funds. We routinely see projects outside of DACs awarded each year. So again, if your project isn't in a DAC, please don't tune out. We also want to emphasize that the use of DAC is not always the most appropriate term for a particular community and should be referenced as a policy and legislative term. You should remember to ask and refer to communities in the ways that they would like to be described when you conduct your engagement. So now turning to what this means in terms of community benefits and engagement in relation to the AHSC program. How do we define community benefits? We are defining community benefits as additional benefits of a project beyond housing and transportation that respond to identified community needs. Some specific examples that will be explored in the case studies a little bit later include specific pedestrian and bike infrastructure enhancements, improved sidewalks and green alleyways. For targeted workforce, they include local hire initiatives to assist a project in completion of the construction and other maintenance. And it also includes community identified needs as community-based commercial spaces and residential services such as financial counseling, language interpretation, etc. It also includes additional transportation services such as CalVans or van pool services that connect gap closures with other transportation infrastructure. It also includes gathering and activity spaces, community gardens, and other public education resources. So these are some specific examples that we'll mention later on when we go over the case studies. Also, just backing up a little bit and wanting to define what we mean by community-based organizations or CBOs and stakeholders who will both be involved in the community engagement process. When we talk about community-based organizations, we're talking about nonprofits or grassroots organizations that work to improve the quality of life for local residents. So that may be around issues relating to public health, transportation safety, immigrant rights, homelessness, reentry population, seniors, etc. When we talk about stakeholders, these may include those who will be served or impacted by the proposed project, such as businesses, surrounding residents, etc. It should be noted that CBOs are trusted representatives and collaborators within the community, and project partners should rely on their guidance and input when discussing project components. CBOs are also integral in convening, connecting, and encouraging participation, especially in rural or underserved areas where there may be limited connections between project partners. Should also note that churches and schools play an integral role in this process as well. Within the program itself, there is a community engagement narrative requirement, and community involvement and leadership are crucial to ensuring that both the principal objectives and co-benefits of the project respond to the true needs of local residents. The narrative section asks applicants to explain how local residents and community-based organizations were meaningfully engaged in developing the project, especially those from disadvantaged and low-income communities, and how the project will address those community-identified needs. The thing to emphasize here that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and community engagement should connect to other parts of the engagement process and requirements of the AHSC program, including anti-displacement policies, workforce development initiatives, climate adaptation, etc. And the stronger overall engagement process should be reflected throughout the entire application, which will all lead to the scoring, which I'll talk about next. So for the scoring criteria for this narrative-based policy, a project can earn up to 15 points in the narrative-based section. The section is also heavily influenced by your engagement with public partners. And so you may want to join some future webinars to learn about assembling these additional narrative pieces. It should also be noted that the community benefits and engagement section is the most heavily weighted part of this narrative-based policy. And there are two additional required documentation, including a letter of support from local community-based grassroots organizations describing the community engagement process and how feedback from local residents was incorporated into the project components. There's also a community engagement tracker, which I'll talk about in a few slides, that provides additional information on events where community participation occurred. And these next two slides will show an overview of scoring criteria related to community benefits and engagement. Again, the emphasis here is that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to engagement, and a potential application must demonstrate that their efforts were more than just checking a box. And so this language is directly from the AHSC guidelines of the narrative rubric. So it includes describing how CBOs and residents have been meaningfully involved. It explains particularly which stages of the process they've been engaged or will be engaged. And it explains efforts to involve historically underserved populations, including how meetings were advertised and made accessible and had accommodations for language or disabilities. In addition, the scoring criteria will consider how the proposed project demonstrated meeting identified community needs and how those were identified. Some examples are through an engagement process, a local needs assessment as part of a local health department plan or other city-county planning process. It will also look at how the proposed project addresses those needs beyond just the housing and transportation. So this goes into those co-benefits that we were talking about that show up throughout other elements of the project as well. As I mentioned before, we talked about the community engagement tracker. So in addition to the narrative component, this tracker is required documentation that provides supporting information that aligns with the narrative elements. The role of the tracker is to verify and provide specific details on engagement activities, including the types of events, number of attendees, language and supportive services provided, and collaboration with CBOs. And we mentioned that community engagement is important to tailor specific needs to the community. And so we want to kind of talk about what that means. So really want to emphasize that continued engagement is an iterative process. It should be an integral part of scoping the project and also continue beyond when the project has been submitted and receives the award and is being built. When we talk about transformative impact, it means that when you listen and collect community needs and feedback, that they're incorporated and addressed to produce tangible outcomes and community benefits. And we'll provide some specific examples from the case studies. And developing this feedback relationship should last through the completion of the application and into the project when it is being built. It also is important that it intersects with local planning efforts, as we mentioned before, such as the anti-displacement strategies, workforce development, etc. So some best practice examples that I'll highlight, and we'll go into more specifics through the case studies, is that several of the projects collaborated with existing events and engagement activities, such as with neighborhood councils, block groups, and community advisory councils. The projects also participated in community cleanups and block parties and community festivals to highlight aspects of the project itself. It also partnered with churches, schools, PTAs, and other religious organizations that have deep ties to the community. Some projects included interactive and inclusive design charrettes to specifically provide feedback on project components. And as I mentioned before, there were some projects that incorporated local hire for actual construction of the project. And as we kind of are in this world and emerging out of the pandemic, we want to stress that virtual engagement during this time is ideal, but we recognize that this approach may not reach every stakeholder. And so additional considerations for targeted in-person engagement should be planned, of course, following public health protocols as those develop. We want to emphasize that telephone access is widely available, so should still be included even when virtual options are made available. And some examples that we have seen have included a tele-town hall, including mobile-friendly options, and providing hotspot access when you have a public engagement meeting. We also want to stress the importance of using analog options. So the use of surveys and follow-up through trusted community-based partners is a good strategy. There's one example from one of the case studies in Imperial County, which sent out active transportation surveys through the utilities water bills and received over 300 responses from residents that directly impacted the design of the active transportation components. The considerations should also take into account accessibility and other accommodations. So language interpretation, some best practices that we've seen through virtual engagement is simultaneous translation, phone-in options with live translation, captions, and breakout rooms. Also to accommodate the ADA, we've seen video interpretation with a sign language interpreter and also captions. And so this is a general timeline for engagement, kind of split up into aligning with the application process. So in the spring to early summer, this is when you really start engaging your partners and start developing the scope and the components. Moving into the fall and early winter, this is when you continue coordinating with community engagement and with your partners to further develop those scoping elements. And then that will take you through the application deadline. And then once the projects have been awarded, early summer is when you should think about continued engagement with those partners to kind of carrying the project into the next phase. So now my colleague Kalila will be describing some successful case studies from around the state and highlighting their community engagement efforts and outcomes. We asked folks at the beginning to fill out a poll, and so if you haven't had a chance to do that, the poll is still open. It looks like the top 3 currently are Los Angeles County, San Francisco County, and Stanislaus County. So Kalila, hopefully that gives you some guidance on which ones to focus on. The other 2 are Ventura and are in Ventura County and Imperial County. So I'll give folks just a couple of minutes to vote. on which case studies you'd like to hear about.
Thanks, Andrew. So we'll give folks just another minute or two and then I'll get started. Okay, this is Kalila from Estolano Advisors. The three case studies that we're going to go through are for projects awarded in the last two rounds 4 and 3, in Los Angeles County, San Francisco County, and Estolano County. The two additional case studies in Ventura County and Imperial County will be included in the presentation that is sent to you all after this, and you can view those on your own time. Cool. So we'll start with the project in LA County. So Manchester Urban Homes is a round 4 winner in South Los Angeles. It's a transit-oriented development project in a disadvantaged community that was awarded about $20 million. The project was led by the Neighborhood Housing Services in collaboration with the City of LA and Wasat Inc. It had a robust community engagement process, engaging over 4,500 local stakeholders over 4 years through a variety of strategies such as block club meetings, neighborhood council meetings, community listening sessions, community organizing. And we'll go to the next slide. So now I'll just go through some of the needs that they identified through the community engagement process and how they addressed them through the project design. So first was a high employment rate in the community, which was addressed through a 25% local hire commitment to build the project, as well as job referral programming in partnership with local workforce development organizations. The second need identified was a lack of public open space and green space, which was addressed through greening and landscaping around the project site, as well as by planting 200 trees around the project. Another major need identified was residents feeling unsafe biking and walking at night. The project design addressed this through creating about over 5,000 feet of dedicated bike lanes on a major corridor surrounding the project, repairing sidewalks on adjacent streets, and adding amenities such as bus shelters, bike racks, and enhanced lighting at bus stops near the project area. Great, so we can go to the next case study, which will be the San Francisco County project. Thanks. So 26 Folsom Street was a round 3 TOD winner in San Francisco County. It was developed by the Mission Economic Development Agency, MEDA, and they're awarded approximately $14 million to convert a parking lot into about 127 units of affordable housing with 29 units dedicated for transition age youth. Project engaged community stakeholders over 3 years through focus groups, large-scale community meetings, tabling at neighborhood fairs, and a widespread survey. And through these tactics, they were able to, create an open forum for feedback and find out that, like, obviously the need for affordable housing is so great in the Mission District that a 2 or 3 story project wouldn't really make a huge difference. And so, based on the community feedback they got, they were able to seek and obtain a rezoning of the site to build a much taller 9-story building to increase the density of affordable housing in the area. Some of the needs identified throughout the community engagement process were affordable childcare, or a need for affordable childcare, which was addressed through creating a child development center on the ground floor of the building that would preserve slots for low-income families in the area. Another need identified was a lack of youth programming, which was addressed through dedicating space on the ground floor as well to community programming for school-age children led by trusted after-school practitioners. And the third need was safer street infrastructure, which was addressed through creating a landscape walkway to connect the project building to a nearby park, giving residents seamless access to that. We can go to the next case study. Stonegate Village is a rural innovation project area type project that was a round 3 winner. It was developed by Self-Help Enterprises, and it was awarded approximately $12 million. The project consists of about 66 units of affordable housing. One unique thing about this project in terms of their community engagement strategy was their partnership with Patterson Promotores, which if you're unfamiliar with the Promotores concept, it's a way to engage Latino immigrant communities through trusted community members who are deeply involved in the community and have a lot of trust. And so by partnering with Patterson Promotores, Self-Help Enterprises was able to create a much more culturally sensitive and trustful engagement process where they were able to gain meaningful feedback from community stakeholders. So we'll go to the next slide. So through that process, some of the needs identified were a need for more employment services, which the developer addressed through partnership with local workforce investment boards to provide on-site employment services for residents and as well as small business support. Another major need identified was a need for more affordable transportation options. This project was able to introduce and expand van pool service in the county, as well as provide transit subsidies to community members. And the third major need identified was high rates of poverty and unemployment, which through partnership with the Central Valley Opportunity Center and the local Workforce Investment Board, the project was able to address through implementing on-site services such as financial literacy workshops, computer training, and English as a second language classes for community members.
Great, thanks, Kalila.
You're welcome.
So with the little bit of time we have left, kind of just wanted to go over some next steps before we move into opening the Q&A. So this is an overview of the program timeline. In late August of this year, the draft guidelines will be released, giving some time for feedback and revisions. In mid-fall and October, the final guidelines will be adopted, and then followed by early November, the notice of funding availability will be released. And that will be open until early February 2021 when applications are due. And then those applications are reviewed through June 2021 when awards are adopted. And the round 5 awards were just released via staff report. So if you're interested in seeing those, they should be posted on the SGC website shortly. And going into some deeper details about the timeline, as I mentioned before, in the spring to early summer, this is when you engage your partners and start developing the scope. In the fall, you continue coordinating that engagement with those partners. In early December, when you're developing the application, this is when you should be finalizing your budget and the scope. In January through February, this is when you should be completing the application elements, including the narrative, the greenhouse gas reduction inputs, and other supporting documentation. And then in the period between April and June, this is when appeals are accepted and processed before the awards are made in June. These are some specific next steps to consider as you're thinking about your community engagement process. You should review the community engagement guidelines that are posted in the program guidelines. You should review your own community engagement plan and identify any gaps that you as a developer or public partner can help fill. You should reach out and engage community-based organization to be a partner. And you should work with that community-based organization to plan additional community engagement activities as needed throughout the process. Here's an overview of the funding from the last 2 rounds and the upcoming round. To note here that more than $1.1 billion has been awarded to date, and the AHSC program will routinely receive 20% of all cap and trade proceeds until 2030. So you can kind of see how that was distributed in rounds 4 and 5. For the upcoming round 6, there's at least $375 million award available, of course, with the max award to be determined later on. And the last 2 webinars are the upcoming events in this series. As you can see, there's been a full series with the first 3 going over some detailed program overview targeted to different audiences, and the last 3 going into specific topics. So I encourage you all to sign up for the remaining 2. And if you're interested in receiving the presentation materials from the first 3, you can reach out to us after this webinar. And that is the end of our slides. And here's our contact information, which I'll leave up for you to write down if you have any specific questions. And we can turn to any questions that haven't been answered. Let me just go back up. So I see that someone asked about monitoring and evaluation required to assess the impact of some of these services offered, such as the amount of people able to successfully be employed within this community. I don't think there's specific requirements, but you should be able to document as specific as possible what type of engagement has happened. I don't know if other folks on the team have a specific response to that. We may need to look into that one a little bit more. So as I mentioned before, all of these questions will be recorded, and we'll send around an official Q&A document that answers these a little bit in more detail. So another person asked about, will the community engagement guidelines for round 6 reflect the implications of restrictions on in-person gatherings and physical distancing? I believe that SGC is working on some type of memo about this, but that has not yet been released. I don't know if an SGC representative wants to go into more detail on that, or we can expand on that in the Q&A document.
And this is Alejandro Huerta with Enterprise. As of now, we are not aware of any changes that are proposed to the actual guidelines themselves.
Great, thanks Alejandro. We also got another question about when will the round 6 max loan limits be decided? That is something that comes from housing community development. So I don't think, I'm not sure exactly when those will be decided, but will definitely be part of the official notice of funding availability in the fall. But we can try and find a more specific date for that. Somebody also asked, do you have any tips for setting community expectations in the event that the AHSC application is not awarded funding to prevent planning fatigue? This is a really great question. I know someone else before mentioned that, you know, there's community engagement that happens for years and years and years before a project ever comes together. So this is recognizing that this is one funding source that kind of allows the project to be completed. So in terms of specific tips, I think that's really where you defer to your partners, you know, not coming in and making grand promises, but really deferring to the CBO partners on what those needs are, and being, you know, honest that this isn't guaranteed. When you're in the application development, it's not guaranteed funding, but it's really just, you know, being an active listener with your CBO partners and the communities that they serve, the communities that the project is serving. I don't know if other folks have specific tips they want to share.
This is Kalila from Estolano Advisors. I would also add that it's very important to partner with trusted community-based organizations during this process. Like Andrew said, when you partner with CBOs who you know, are continuously working in communities and are engaging community members, it doesn't come in as like a random event. It can be folded into their regular engagement processes with communities, so that you know, even in the event that your project is not awarded and it does not go through, the community still has ways to engage and respond to the proposal that are established and organic and are not invasive. And so that sort of helps lessen the potential of you know, engagement fatigue.
Thanks, Leo. That was a really important point. And just to add on to that, it's really emphasizing here the partnership and collaboration. So that should be the key part here, that recognizing that there is most likely planning processes that have been happening or have tried and failed for many years for particular communities. So just being sensitive and recognizing that also when you approach your community partners and other partners related to the project. I don't see any other questions that haven't been answered, so giving folks a few minutes since we have time to raise any additional questions in the chat box, and we'll just hang around to address those questions.
Andre, this is Julia from Enterprise. There was a question that was sent to me privately. I'm just gonna read it out loud to you. Do you have any guidance for cities that really don't have any strong CBOs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that if you don't know of any strong CBOs, you know, it also should take into account other types of community groups. Even if a particular area doesn't have quote unquote strong community groups, there's most likely a neighborhood group or somebody in the project area that is going to be impacted by the project. And so it's important to, you know, be engaged and find out who those folks are, because, you know, if they're directly impacted by the project, they will most likely have vital information to share and to help scope out the project.
Yeah, this is Kalila. I would also add that there may be other institutions within the area that you could reach out to that might not present as like a CBO necessarily. I think the first things that come to mind are houses of worship like churches or synagogues or what have you, that regularly are convening spaces for community members. I think if you are, really pressed to find anybody that's actually doing organizing, then looking at spaces where folks convene, such as churches, such as, community markets, farmers markets, things like that, to sort of build a presence, without formal CBO support would be a good way to start. For example, one of the projects that we went through in SF County that did a lot of engagement at neighborhood fairs and stuff like that. So if there are, events happening in this community that you're in that, where people are going to be at, then you should be there probably, if there's no one else for you to turn to. And I think also if there are, trusted city staff that regularly engage with community members, that's also another avenue.
Yeah, thanks, Kalila. And I also add that we mentioned before that schools are maybe undervalued resource. There's most likely a PTA group or, families that live in the area. And so that is a way for you to figure out your engagement through schools. And also building off Kalila's point about city staff or people who work in public agencies who live in the area, I think just kind of talking to folks and seeing who might be doing engagement or convening community residents. A couple of questions came in. I saw that Richard responded to the employment benefits and outcomes reporting. So thank you for chiming in with that. Also mentioned that Kern County has some examples of working with neighborhood collaboratives. So those are also groups that should be in other parts of the state. If you're kind of building off of this question too, if we're talking about rural areas, the same type of guidance applies. Schools, churches, or religious organizations, neighborhood groups, or councils. Those are all places to start, and you can kind of build off of that. Any other questions? Someone just asked about city support letters. So when we were talking about CBO support letters, that's specifically for the community engagement partners that are part of this. There's a separate process for getting letters of support from public agencies. So yes, you do need support from public agencies, but it's a little bit of a different process. And we can provide more information on that and point you to the guidelines as well.
This is Alejandro Huerta with Enterprise. Yeah, quickly, that's part of usually the resolution if a public partner like a city or a county is a formal joint applicant on the application, in which case the resolution speaks to the city's commitment to enter into a partnership with the developer. So that's usually what that looks like. Strictly speaking, a city support letter is not necessary, though oftentimes many applicants do include them anyway, and moreover, cities volunteer them. So just be aware of that.
Great, thanks, Alejandro. It's 10:55. We've scheduled this till 11, so we will hang around if other questions come up. As we mentioned, our emails are posted here. If you have any specific questions or maybe more sensitive questions you want to ask privately, we have our emails available. And also, if you registered for this event, you'll be receiving the slides and any follow-up after this webinar. So stay tuned for that. So thank you for joining, everyone. And yeah, have a good rest of the week. I saw two questions pop up. So Haley, maybe we can connect offline about your specific questions about co-applicants. I'm not really understanding your question or what your question is. And in terms of seeing more successful case studies, all of the past applications are available for public viewing through a site called FAST, and we can post the link to that. Where you can browse every successful and unsuccessful project and see all of the application elements. If you kind of just want to click through that. So we can post that link in a second. To Haley's question, so the developer, most likely the developer should apply with the public agency partner, but the partnership does not have to be that formal. So the developer could apply on their own if the city or BART is supporting other projects, but the city can also support multiple applications. So either scenario is fine on that one.
Julia, could you answer that regarding your previous experience?
Sure. It usually, when it comes, yeah, sorry, I was on mute. When it comes to transit agencies, it is not required that a transit agency apply as a joint applicant unless they want to. So it just depends on their level of comfort. In previous applications with BART, it has kind of gone either way, but no, BART does not have to be a joint applicant with the developer, and actually neither does the city. The same would apply for the city. It just depends on their comfort level and the kind of legal structure that they want to establish. If they are not applying as a joint applicant, then ultimately all parties would be signing side agreements, and will, once the awards are made, would enter into a contract so that everyone is responsible for building the things that they said they would build. But if you want any more information on that, I'm happy to answer more specific questions, Haley. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and stop recording and then end the meeting. Thank you everyone for joining.